Hey everyone, today I wanted to do something a little bit different and actually provide you guys with the best Palamute meta build that's become available since the latest patch update for the third free title update. Essentially, a lot of changes underwent kind of like under the hood in the patch notes, which we went over as the recent free title update went live. And a lot of the changes that we got to see was the Silk Binder, which was like the main meta weapon that everyone was using for the Palamutes, their doggos, simply got nerfed, not necessarily to the ground, but enough that there are better options now available there. So in this video, I'm going to try to showcase you guys just how much better melee elemental Palamute setups have become and how reliant they are on just simply just being able to do really good damage. And something along the lines of like 20 to 30% of a monster's entire health bar will be taken down by your Palamute if you just simply make sure you have the proper setup. So chances are most of you were already using the Silk Binder, which was reliant on range centric, range attack up, piercing attack up L, and attack up small. You had your Palamute kind of like automatically use the Silk Binders either through activating it by doing mounting damage or just kind of like as they triggered it naturally. Now what we have ended up finding out is that melee elemental setups are a little bit more powerful if you use the dual bladed chain gear slot as number 1 and the blitz scroll as number 2. Obviously also you're gonna need to equip the best elemental weapon for each monster you're going to be fighting. That is probably the biggest drawback, because with Silk Binder you could just kind of like focus on whichever monster you were going to fight, because the main damage you were doing came from pierce damage, which was like extremely reliant on that. Mostly positioning, but it didn't necessarily matter since your dogs kind of move around on their own. Now the biggest focus for you to be able to do massive damage to a monster specifically comes from you making sure that you have the proper weapon equipped for the elemental weakness of any given monster. So if you're one of those players that kind of already switches your own personal gear based on the monster that you're about to go hunt, you are using an elemental setup, which has become extremely popular and more powerful since the latest patch, chances are now you should be doing the same thing for your Palamute. And thankfully, of course, just like your very own personal armor set, you can kind of set up your whole loadout for your Palamute and just automatically go ahead and set that up for each elemental weapon, which you're going to be going over. So what we have here is that you're going to set your dogs to simply basic attack setup. You're not going to focus on pincer. You're not going to focus on follow. Those are not necessary. Basic should be good enough. You're also going to use the equipped skills melee centric, attack up small, counter, elemental attack up, and artful dodger. The reason for why we're setting up artful dodger is because your Palamute will be focusing more on melee, so you need to make sure that they have a little bit of a survivability tactic. The same thing can also be said for counter, which gives you a little bit of extra damage as well whenever they take a hit. Elemental attack up is pretty much a no-brainer. Attack up small instead of attack up large, because you do run out of enough slots, skill memory slots. And of course melee centric, so your Palamutes can focus more on doing melee damage instead of just focusing, of course, on the range options. It's also worth noting that some of the weapons can automatically trigger the dual bladed change, which is pretty much the main option for you to be able to do massive damage with this setup. Like hammer, I know light bowgun, I know heavy bowgun, bows as well can kind of like trigger them automatically. But other weapons like dual blades also like struggle on being able to like kind of activate this. Is one of those where like I mentioned, Silk Binder was instantly triggered by doing mountain damage or just kind of like range damage on your own. But dual bladed are kind of like the scrolls, they kind of trigger on their own. So it's one of those where like depending on the weapon, you might necessarily want to like choose this option or just stick to Silk Binders. It's really going to be ultimately up to you. But if you do want to do massive damage at the end of the day, dual bladed chain is probably going to be the way to go on most weapons. So in the video background, you should also be able to see, as I overlay some of the details that I'm mentioning, you should also be able to see eventually like me fighting the dummy. As you can kind of just see, both dogs, Sakura and Ingrid, kind of like trigger both the scroll and the dual bladed chain kind of like on their own, as I'm just spamming my normal attacks with my weapon. It's one of those things where like usually as a monster kind of moves into a brand new area, they're gonna pop the scroll, they're gonna pop the dual chain. It's gonna stay up for a long enough time before they eventually go away. The monster moves into a different area, and then eventually, you know, they just kind of like instantly re-trigger them as you move into a new zone. The cooldown is relatively short for both of them, and if you're using, again, a specific, like probably one of the better weapons for each one, you're going to have that big advantage. And what you're going to notice is that your dogs are going to be continually doing a pretty decent chunk of damage, and it's just beneficial. But the problem is, of course, once again, there are some drawbacks since the monsters are kind of like, you know, constantly moving. So you do need to understand that because the Palamutes are going to be kind of like sticking to the monsters, if the monster is kind of like continually moving, like Furious Rajan, for example, you might have like inconsistent damage, for example. Dual Bladed Chains, like I mentioned, doesn't necessarily instantly activate. It activates on its own. Your Palamutes will be able to activate it based on some of the specific weapon combos, but again, I haven't necessarily done the full research on which specific weapon combos and how all the weapons can automatically trigger them. But again, it falls into the inconsistency side of things. But once they're active, you're going to be seeing massive damage being dished out. You also are going to be able to continually swap the weapons. You should be able to see eventually me overlay the videos for each one of the single elemental best weapons that you're going to have. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit. But more importantly as well, whenever you have your Palamutes kind of like standing distance away from a monster, and they're not necessarily too close to the monster itself, they're going to be continually tossing kunais. And that used to be fine if you're using silk binders, but not anymore. So you always kind of want to make sure that your dogs are close to specifically the monster. If you're already using a melee weapon, the dogs are going to kind of like do that on their own. But if you're a gunner like me, you also kind of need to keep your eyes peeled on your dogs to make sure that they're constantly, you know, fighting the monster and chasing after them. Most of the AI handles that. You don't necessarily have to worry about it, but you should be able to keep that in mind. Now, before we go over each one of the best elemental weapons for your Palamute, it's worth mentioning that if you're still going to be trying to use status, this setup doesn't necessarily work for status weapon. A lot of people use the jelly bag, for example, for like paralyze. This is not probably going to be very optimal if you're trying to use like statuses. There are different buildups if you want to do that. Silk binder is still probably the best way for you to be able to make best use of the jelly. If you're going for after sleep or poison, there's different builds for that. This one is more specifically focused on elemental damage and against just raw damage through element. If you're looking for the best Dragon Palamute weapon, chances are you're going to go for Crimson Glow Valstrax. If you're looking for the best fire weapon for your Palamute, you're probably going to go after the Rathalos Palamute weapon. Kushala Daodra's Scythe X is most likely the best one for ice elemental damage. Zenogre's Thunderblade is most likely the best one for lightning damage. If you're going after water, you're going to focus on Almudron's elemental weapon. And lastly, if you're going after blast, you're going to need Bazelgeuse's Mace X, and that is the weapon you're going to have to set up. Now, one of the best benefits that you will have to take advantage of with these elemental setups, and it's kind of like in the same way that you already have set up presumably for your hunter. Each equipment loadout should be something that you should have kind of have already set up. You can set that up for each one of your dogs separately, or kind of like just they copy each other. You're going to need 2 copies of that specific weapon. Obviously, Dragon, Fire, Ice, Lightning, Water, and Blast. And of course, whichever best armor you have available. For me personally, I go after the Valstrax armor set because it doesn't necessarily give you any massive weaknesses, and it does give you some dragon resistance, which most likely are the monsters that are going to do your Palamute the most amount of harm. At the same time, though, once you kind of set up your equipment loadout for each one of the elements, that's pretty much it. As you go into, you set up your own weapon and you choose your own elemental. Again, if you're using one of those elemental setups for your weapons, it's going to be the same setup for the buddy board and elemental loadouts. So it's not going to be any different. You just swap out for whatever element you're about to fight, elemental weakness for whatever monster you're going to fight, and be able to take full advantage of that. So there's no real drawbacks here, other than, again, it might take 15 seconds for you to be able to go through the menu and go ahead and do that. But the benefits kind of outweigh the 15 to 20 seconds it might take you to kind of set up the whole elemental. Once you set up elemental loadout, you're not necessarily going to ever do that again, because again, unless the next patch changes this entirely, and then we don't presume that it will. It took Silk Binders 3 patches for them to be able to fully nerf it, so we didn't expect them to necessarily do that again. At the same time, though, I will tell you this, and I kind of mentioned this casually before. If you are just focused on like status or poison or maybe even sleep for whatever reason, Silk Binder is still probably the easiest way, since you don't necessarily have to change the weapons. You just kind of already have a preloaded setup for your Silk Binders. Your elemental dogs, your Silk Binder dogs are still going to do, paralyze for the most part relatively easy. and you could just focus on that. If you really want to focus on elemental damage, this is most likely the best setup now available after the 3rd free title update. I will be leaving a link in the description below, and I'll be typing out all the details as well if you didn't necessarily catch a quick glance of the overlays that I put up in the video, so you can see the best setup, the best skills, the setting up your Palamute for basic, and of course the weapons typed out fully as well, so you already know which elemental best weapon is available for each one, so you can just kind of preset that up, craft them on your own pace, and then just set up your Palamutes to be able to do massive damage. And of course, both Palamutes are set up the same way. There's no real difference between each one of them. Both Palamutes are going to have the same setup, the same weapon, the same armor, you know, the same skills, all of that. So you're just, one is going to be a copy of another, and you're just going to be able to reap the rewards in that matter. Hopefully this video has been informational with you guys. I don't necessarily always do tutorial videos or guide videos, but when it comes to like Palamutes and stuff, since we are all usually seem to be running those now, Meowsers and Palicos are not necessarily all that popular anymore. You know, it's always beneficial to have the most amount of damage available, simply put. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.